Hi everyone, I'm back with another video about Hellclock, and I want to show you some more advanced endgame farming strategies. So especially if you're doing the Ascension endgame and you have to beat the game in only a certain number of runs, you want to try to be as efficient as possible. So you see here, for example, right now, this is the Hell 100 run. I'm in Act 1 and I'm just trying to get as powerful as possible in as little runs as possible. So this is kind of the main objective in order to not run out of runs and then fail the entire Ascension reset, basically. And the one way to do this the most efficiently is to farm cursed shrines. So you can find these once in the endgame in every act. There are usually 4, sometimes 5, I think, in every act. And you can farm them for their elites. You see here there's a lot of these rare elites popping out of the shrines. I think it's something like around 10 or so. And each of those rare elites drops soul stones. So soul stones is kind of like the primary currency that you're trying to acquire in order to progress your Infernal Bell levels, get stronger through those, like for example, base damage upgrades and whatever skill upgrades, crit upgrades, resistances, and so on that you can get there. And this is kind of like one of the main like meta progression systems throughout an Ascension run. And the way to do this most efficiently is to just not finish the cursed shrines. So you see this here right now where I am in floor 4. This is like one of the very early runs. This is like the 3rd run right now that I'm doing on this Ascension. And I found this cursed shrine in a very early floor. And I'm just like kind of farming those elites over and over in every single run. I know I won't be able to finish entire Act 1 at this point. So what you do is you just leave the last elite alive. You can actually see them with the dot on the minimap. And whenever there's only one left, you know this is the last guy. Because first you have to defeat all these waves here. So when you start the cursed shrine, there's like a bunch of normal monsters spawning and like one elite with each wave or something like that. And then at the end of the 3 waves, you have just like a sequence of elites coming like back to back to back to back. First there's 2 at a time, and then there's 3 at a time. And once you defeat one of those, the next guy spawns until they stop spawning. So this is kind of the moment and the cue for you to leave when only one guy is left. And then you can come back the next run and farm all those elites again and get the soul stones again. So you can see this here right now. There's 2 elites. Now one died, the next guy spawned. Now this guy dies, the next guy spawns. And now we actually have 3 of them here. So this is the moment where you start being a bit careful and kind of like slowly kill them one by one until you realize, okay, there is only one guy left. And now we just run away. Now you have to keep in mind that sometimes there are certain elites that follow you very well or that actually teleport to you. This is an affix, and they can actually teleport over the entire map. So you want to be careful with that and not accidentally let them TP to you and then you accidentally kill them. So potentially you might have to skip the rest of the floor without attacking, depending on which skill you're using and how well you can actually position your attacks to make sure that you don't accidentally hit the last guy and finish off the cursed shrine. But as long as you don't finish the cursed shrine, you can come back in the next run and the next run and the next run, and you get a lot of soul stones. So especially early on in Act 1, for example, here you saw I have floor 4 and floor 5 back to back a shrine. This is obviously the kind of the dream scenario where you get a lot of the soul stones very early on while you're still very weak, and you can use that to your advantage. One thing that I recommend, especially once you're already in like the higher hell levels with a lot of constellation points unlocked, is to also get the upgrade here from the Sao Longuinho upgrade here, the Seeker, where when you defeat a rare monster, all the loot flies to you. This allows you to kind of just like, leave the loot on the ground as you're fighting all these elites and you kite away from the shrine. And then the last guy that you kill will, suck up all the loot to you and all the soul stones. And you don't have to necessarily risk running back towards the shrine, picking all the stuff, and then accidentally killing the last elite, for example. Especially on minion builds where you can't really control your damage output, this is really important, so you should try to get this thing. It's also just generally very high quality of life and very fun to use this. Another tip I can give with the bell itself is also that you should really invest into the Soulstone Gain as much as possible right from the start. So I do this basically every single run. I try to max out the Soulstone Gain here, and then there's a bunch of others. You kind of go through them anyway as you, for example, unlock the extra relic upgrades inventory. So here's those relic upgrades, and there's also Soulstone Gain, and so on. But you don't need to necessarily max them out to reach the upgrade, but I would really recommend doing that. because it kind of like ramps by itself and it kind of pays off over time, because you start getting more soul stones right from the get-go, and then you get more and more and more, and you get more points all over the tree. But it also depends a little bit on like how is your run going. For example, you might be very weak, or you might try something quite challenging, like going through Act 1 with like a very weak build, or you just can't find the right relic for it or so, and you're kind of running out of runs until you finish the act, for example. So you might have to do a respec and then, you know, build more into power, or maybe you just don't survive enough and you want to pick up the G Dev or something like that. So there's stuff like this here where it might make sense to do a respec, which is luckily very cheap. I think it's like 10 soul stones per point you have spent. So for example, later in Act 1, you might have like 20, 30, 40 points or so. So it costs like a few hundred, for example, to do a respec real quick, and maybe take out some of the Soulstone gains and then put a bit more power, just in order to make sure that you don't run out of the attempts to finish the act. But these extra Soulstone gains help, and you can also find relics that do the same, especially like small relics that just have like plus 5% Soulstone gain or something. I just have like a fresh ascension here. I don't have any gear, but this is also another thing you can look for, and just put them in your inventory, and also this helps you out to grind up those upgrades much faster. In general, I would recommend to mostly farm in Act 2. So once you get through the early game and you have your first upgrades and you kind of like establish your build and you beat Act 1, I would recommend to spend as much time as possible in Act 2. That's kind of like the primary farming area, I would say. It's relatively easy to go for Act 2 because by then you usually have your build kind of working and set up. But also it seems like there's just like the most Soulstone gains available there. You have pretty good cursed shrines, and in general, it's kind of like the area to farm, I think. Act 3, for example, that you see right now is relatively weak, so it's not really rewarding, but also the monsters scale up quite a lot going from Act 2 to Act 3. So if you're not really powerful and you have like a really crazy build, then stuff can get really tanky really fast. And you also have, for example, this kind of like, you know, train like area where you just don't really get so much stuff going there. So I would really recommend to stay in Act 2 as long as possible until you feel like you have farmed enough and you are powerful enough to kind of finish the entire Act 3 in one go, or maybe in 2 goes. So you can go in, then get some item upgrades, and then kind of like rush through Act 3 in like a, you know, one run basically. But yeah, usually in a hell run, you have 21 total runs, you get 7 per act. So for me, usually this is kind of like the first act is like somewhere in the range of like 3 to 5 runs or something like that. So I have a few left over, then I go to Act 2 and I farm that for as long as I need. That can be also between like 5 to 10 runs. So I actually kind of like overspent there a little bit. And after unlocking Act 3, you get extra 7 runs again. But you don't really want to spend time in Act 3. It's just kind of like to finish out the Hell Ascension basically. So you spend more time in Act 2 trying to farm out those especially rare relics at some point. You want to try to fill the entire inventory with like, you know, first the important unique relics and then more and more rare relics that will have like big multipliers, for example. And when you feel like you have enough, this is when you go to Act 3 and you finish the run. Some other generic tips I can give you, especially for the Infernal Bell, that would help you is base damage is really good. So there are various nodes here that go to the south. So this is the biggest one with the plus 50 per point, but there's also like here 35 and another like 35. So this usually helps you out quite a lot, especially in the early acts. You don't have that much base damage, and this is pretty powerful. And then depending on the build, you might want to go for certain stats. I tend to go for like the crit stuff relatively early, or the second wind relatively early, because especially in like the very high hell levels, like a hell 75 plus or so, you tend to have incredible negative resistances, and you can very easily get one-tapped. So having second wind can be really useful. So I try to pick that up to not accidentally end the run too early, for example, while farming those cursed shrines. This is usually kind of like the hardest part to do, especially when you're trying to keep some stuff alive and not finish the shrine. You only just kind of, you know, do that on the last run through the act when you kind of push through and you collect all the cursed shrines, you collect all the constellation points, finish the act, and then go to the next basically. And in this case, second wind is very helpful. Also, the reliquary size upgrades are kind of like a really core. I think also the fourth blessing and the blessing banish is something to pick up pretty early together with the soulstone gains here. This is all kind of like one path that I take here usually at the start. And you also have the skill ranks. So depending on your mana, the concerns, you want to get this usually also quite early. And at least in late game max this out because it's a pretty important damage scaler. Another tip I can give is also to kind of keep the skill bar relatively empty, especially in Act 1. You don't really need a mobility skill, for example. So you can easily get away without a dash or without a passage. And usually I focus on like one like spender, so something like split shot we have here, but it can also be something else. And like one kind of cooldown ability, for example, so Matadaira is like something I like. So I kind of expand this on cooldown and then spend my mana with this. And with only 2 skills on the bar, you get way fewer choices in the blessings when you level up. So it's much easier to kind of ramp up the damage for your main abilities, and you don't really benefit so much from some of those, for example, auras here, like the Prayer of Vengeance early on anyway. With level 1, this is just kind of like a weak bonus, and you can't really get to 100% crit chance so easily, you can't really scale a crit damage that well. But once you have higher levels, for example with those Infernal Bell upgrades that I just showed, suddenly this Prayer of Vengeance becomes a lot more useful, and I actually start putting this into a lot of my builds. So for example, near the end of Act 1 or in Act 2, I would do something like this, and then at some point I will also do something like this. When I feel like I am kind of established, I am powerful enough, I want to go faster, farm up my stuff more quickly, then I start putting more and more skills on the bar. And also, for example, once you unlock the extra blessings and the extra banish for the blessings, you have a lot more options and you can play around the more skills on your bar. And then depending on the exact setup that you do, obviously there's many builds available, but I like to do is just do like the typical combo, Prayer of Vengeance plus Judgment. It's just like a really strong like damage boost. So here's like the minus res, and then you have the extra crit scaling here. But this might not apply to elements, I'm not sure exactly. So if you're doing such like dot build maybe, then this is not really an idea. But obviously there are tons of other options available, but this has been working pretty well for me. Another thing I've tried is actually slow time. There are some relics for that, for example, to get tons of conviction, and that conviction can then be transformed into extra damage, especially for spells, and it can also be pretty powerful. Or another run, I used Reflexes, which has a relic where you get extra movement and attack speed. So for example, for double knives, I used that to just kind of like fly through the maps faster, farm really quickly. I was running at 400% movement speed or something like that, and it's just kind of like blitzing through those floors, and it was really fun. Also, especially at the start of a new hell run, when you are really weak and you don't have gear and healing, Prayer of Health is actually a pretty good option, so I can recommend that. So for example, you can use Prayer of Vengeance later once you're established, but early on Prayer of Health just gives you life regen, and you can also activate it for like a burst of healing and a damage reduction in effect. This can be really useful to not just randomly run out of potions and die, for example, because you might kind of like struggle to sustain, especially when you don't have a lifesteal ring. Lifesteal is very powerful in Hellclock, so you usually want to have that on most builds at some point, but it might take a while to get one, and so Prayer of Health is like the early game choice for this. And alternatively, Closed Body also does the job here with conviction generation, so this is like the shield basically. This is basically the other option that it can go for. So you can play around conviction, but I have personally not really done this very much. Another tip I can give is also that every time you go to the next act, you instantly unlock the next tier of loot. So in Act 1, you will have tier 1 and tier 2 loot. In Act 2, you have 3 and 4, and then in Act 3, you have 5 and 6. And you always get the uneven number right away when you enter the act for the first time. So technically you can just like go into the first floor and then finish the run and immediately buy the next tier of item. But what I usually do is I try to also beat the first boss of the next act, because that also unlocks the next even number. So in Act 1, for example, you get tier 2 items after defeating the merchant in floor 7. And in Act 2, you get tier 4 loot after you have beaten the like cannoneer guy in floor 7, and so on. So it's always floor 7 or floor 8 in Act 3, where it's like the big boss, the first one. And then you can go back to town and start rolling for example, especially a higher tier revolver for more base damage and more percent damage on your gear. So this is especially relevant after beating Act 2, where most of the time you kind of want to stay there a little bit and, you know, grind up more soul stones, grind up more relics and so on. But sometimes I would just go straight into Act 3, defeat the first boss, finish the run, and then try to get those tier 6 items. And lastly, some tips for the Constellation. So I already mentioned the Seeker node here, where you get all the loot vacuum to you. This is really good. But also just kind of like to get into Act 2 and out of Act 1 can be a bit of a struggle on the higher hell levels. And for that, we have a few defensive notes that I would recommend. So there's, for example, easy 30% life you can pick up here in some cases. There's also this vigor stacks mechanic where you get like a damage reduction effect. So you have this here, you get 3% damage reduction up to 5 times. And this just helps you to survive, especially Act 1, where I feel like I tend to struggle the most and I tend to get one-shot the most because I just don't have resistances, I don't have a lot of life, and stuff actually really hurts on those higher head levels. So this can be useful. And for example, here with this Chart of Ogum, you have also like a mana, like infinite mana effect basically. So every time you run out of mana, you spend those vigor stacks and then you don't have the damage reduction anymore, but you can spam your abilities. This can also be a pretty big DPS boost early on, whereas you're still trying to figure out your gear, trying to get more mana affixes on your gear, and just give you a lot more DPS to go through the first act. There's also a few other ways to solve this. For example, over here, there's like a lot of mana on this Constellation. So I tend to pick these up even knowing that I will not really need them later, but they really help in the early game. And for example, also for life recovery and extra life here, there's this red one, there's extra life again, and there's also life regeneration. It's just having a tiny bit of regeneration really helps, even knowing that later I will have a lifesteal ring and I will instantly full heal all the time and so on. Having this life regeneration, especially early in Act 1, is really useful and potentially can allow you to drop the prayer of healing earlier and still stay alive pretty easily. Finally, some pretty good starter skills, especially for the first runs in Act 1 when you're really weak and you have nothing, are the Bell. So I recommend the Bell. This is pretty good. You can also do some stuff with the minions. So I noticed like summon the guard and maybe even combine with the Phantom Marksman. They're both physical, for example. And you can kind of like combine some synergies there. That is really useful. And the Quill is not bad on it by itself as well, so you can do that. And a favorite of mine is the Matadeira. This is, it's just like a cooldown based skill, so you want to combine this with something else that spends mana. But I also like having this here just to kind of like blast down some of those bigger packs, and it actually does a good amount of damage by itself. There's other skills here that I have not really tried to do Hell 100 with, for example, in the first runs of Act 1. Or some that I know are relatively weak by themselves. So for example, double knives needs a lot of work to get online. Same with the lash, for example, that's kind of tough. And you also have skills that are more of like a supporting nature, like lasso, that also probably doesn't really work well. But yeah, those are some of those kind of typical choices that I would start the run with. And then you kind of see what relics you get and what you want to build towards. And even if, for example, your constellations don't really match, so if maybe you want to build into something like Split Shot and the Blunderbuss build, this is like one of the most powerful things I have played. But it also requires a bunch of relics. You might not want to start with this exactly, but it works, I guess. And maybe you have invested a lot into projectile stuff on the constellation tree, but it's still okay to start with something like the Bell because it just kind of works by default, and then wait until you get like your first upgrades and your first relics and then do a switch. So I'm gonna leave you with this. I hope this helps you to complete the game and finish the highest difficulties. Let me know what you think, or maybe other tips that you have from playing Hell Clock. But this is what I got here for now. So hope you enjoyed this. I had a ton of fun with the game, so maybe you do too, and stay tuned for more videos coming out. So hope you like this and see you guys next time.